The lion didn't roar. He just fell, right there in the middle of the road, as if the weight of the world had finally crushed him. Thomas Rayner slammed the brakes so hard his old pickup fishtailed. The sun was dipping below the hills, casting long shadows across the empty road. And for a second, Thomas thought it was a hallucination. But the massive body didn't move, didn't flinch, didn't breathe like a trick of the light. It was real. A lion. On a back road in rural Arizona. And his chest wasn't rising. Thomas hadn't cried since the funeral. It had been 9 months since he buried his wife, Linda. 9 months of quiet dinners, unanswered calls from his daughter, and sitting on the same porch swing they once shared. He drove these roads at dusk to escape the silence, the house, himself, but nothing in all his grief prevention drives had prepared him for this. A lion. In America. Dying, and staring straight into him, like it knew something about him he'd tried to forget. The animal's golden eyes were half shut, heavy with pain, but still sharp enough to pierce through the windshield and into Thomas's chest. He stepped out slowly, leaving the engine running, boots crunching the gravel. "You're not supposed to be here," he muttered, unsure if he was speaking to the animal or himself. The lion flinched, barely, its massive frame trembling with each labored breath. There was blood. Not fresh, but dried and cracked around its front leg, matted into the tawny fur. It looked ancient, broken, but not wild. Thomas had once been a vet tech before he chose sales over stethoscopes. That was a lifetime ago, back when he thought he had all the time in the world. Now, looking at the lion, he felt like the years had collapsed into this one impossible moment. He crouched down, careful not to startle the beast, and saw the thick leather collar half hidden in the mane. "Jesus," he whispered, "you're not wild at all." This wasn't just a lion. This was someone's lion. Someone had kept him and lost him. Memories came uninvited, of Linda's laugh, of the animal shelter they used to volunteer at, of how she once cried for a week after a dog they'd fostered was euthanized. He'd called her too soft. Now here he was on his knees in the dirt, choking on emotion over a lion he'd never seen before. The irony wasn't lost on him. The beast wheezed, eyes fluttering, then focused again. And Thomas knew, whatever this was, it wasn't random. This lion needed someone, and maybe so did he. He looked around, not a car in sight. No phone service. Just him and this dying animal in the middle of nowhere. The wind had picked up, sending dust skimming across the road. The lion's eyes closed again, slower this time, and its body sagged. Thomas stood up fast, panic rising. "Not yet," he said aloud, as if his voice could tether the animal to life. He grabbed his coat from the truck and covered the lion's back. It was the only thing he could think to do. It was the only thing that felt human. For a brief moment, the lion opened one eye. It wasn't defiance. It wasn't fear. It was something else entirely, like recognition. Like he'd seen Thomas before, or at least seen the same kind of brokenness in someone else. That single look undid something in Thomas, cracked open a space he thought had sealed with Linda's passing. He swallowed hard. This wasn't about saving a lion. Not really. It was about something much older, much deeper. Somewhere beyond the trees, a faint sound echoed. A motor. Faint, then closer. Thomas stepped into the middle of the road, waving his arms as headlights crested a hill. A ranger truck, judging by the shape. Relief flooded him, but with it came a new kind of fear. What would they do with a lion out here? Euthanize him, confiscate him, put him in a cage somewhere far away? Thomas looked back at the lion, who hadn't moved, hadn't blinked. "I won't let them hurt you," he said, surprising even himself. The truck slowed. A door opened. A uniformed man stepped out, eyes wide. "You're not gonna believe this," Thomas called out, voice steady but low. The ranger stepped forward slowly, hand near his belt. "Is it alive?" he asked. Thomas nodded. "Barely." The ranger's radio crackled. Thomas looked down at the lion and saw the smallest twitch of an ear. He knelt again, laid a hand gently on the animal's paw. "Hang on, big guy," he whispered. "You're not done yet." And in that moment, neither was he. The ranger's name was Officer Delgado, and the second he saw the collar around the lion's neck, his whole demeanor changed. "This is someone's pet," he said, crouching beside Thomas with a mix of awe and concern. Or was. Thomas didn't look up. His hand remained on the lion's paw, feeling the faintest tremor of life beneath his fingertips. "We can't leave him here," Thomas said, voice hushed but resolute. Delgado nodded slowly, but his face tightened. "This isn't just about rescue anymore," he said. "This is complicated." They called it in. Delgado's radio crackled with dispatch codes and partial coordinates. Meanwhile, the lion shifted again. A deep, dry cough that shook dust from his mane. He was severely dehydrated, underweight, and the wound on his front leg looked infected. Thomas helped Delgado examine him, their hands working in silent coordination. "He's got old scars too," Thomas observed. "This isn't just a recent escape, he's been through hell." Delgado looked at him carefully. "You sure you've never done this before?" Thomas didn't answer. He was too focused, too determined. Delgado's partner arrived 20 minutes later with a tranquilizer gun and a metal crate barely large enough to hold the lion's body. Thomas stood between them and the animal, his back straight. "We sedate him wrong. He could die," he argued. "That leg's close to septic, his breathing's shallow. He needs fluids first, antibiotics, not a dart to the ribs." The other ranger, a younger man with mirrored sunglasses, raised an eyebrow. "And you're a vet now?" Thomas took a breath. "No, but I know what dying looks like, and he's not ready to give up yet." Against protocol, they listened. Delgado had seen enough animals in crisis to know when rules had to bend. With care, they rolled the lion onto a tarp and lifted him into the bed of Thomas's truck, which would drive smoother than the rattling ranger vehicle. Thomas insisted on riding in the back with him, keeping the coat over his body and a steady hand on his flank. Every bump in the road felt like a threat. Every shallow breath counted. They drove toward the nearest wildlife facility, an hour away, with no idea if the lion would make it. Inside the truck bed, Thomas never took his eyes off the animal. The sun had set completely, and the headlights carved through darkness like twin blades. The lion's chest rose and fell with uneven rhythm. "You're not dying in the back of my truck," Thomas murmured. "Not after all this. Not after you looked at me like that." His voice cracked. For the first time in months, the walls around his grief didn't feel solid. They felt like paper, wet and sagging, ready to give way. They arrived at the wildlife center just before midnight. Staff were already waiting, alerted by Delgado's call. A team of vets and techs swarmed the lion, wheeling him into a surgical bay under sterile light. Thomas stood just outside the glass, blood-stained and wind-burnt, watching through the pain like a man watching his own heart being operated on. One of the techs turned and asked, "Name?" Thomas blinked. "What?" "His name," she said. "We'll need to log him." Thomas looked through the glass, his eyes wet. "Leo," he said quietly. "His name is Leo." While the surgery began, Delgado pulled Thomas aside. "They're going to report this. There'll be investigations. Private ownership of exotics like this is illegal in most of the state." Thomas nodded. He wasn't thinking about legalities. He was thinking about Leo's eyes, the pain, the trust, the eerie familiarity. "Do you think he belonged to someone nearby?" Thomas asked. Delgado sighed. "Maybe. Or he was trafficked, smuggled. There's a lot of that, and they always suffer the most." Thomas clenched his jaw. "He's not suffering anymore. Not if I can help it." Thomas stayed at the center overnight, refusing to leave until the staff finally let him sit in a chair outside recovery. He hadn't planned any of this. He'd just gone out for a drive like he always did, trying to outrun the silence. But now that silence had a shape, a name. Leo. And Leo had fought to stay alive just long enough to be seen. Thomas realized something he hadn't dared admit before. He didn't want to be alone anymore. Not in that house, not in his grief, not in this world. Early in the morning, one of the veterinarians came out with a cautious smile. "He's stable," she said. "Weak, but responsive. If infection doesn't spread, he might pull through." Thomas exhaled like he'd been holding his breath for years. "Can I see him?" he asked. "Just for a moment." She nodded. He walked into the recovery room where Leo lay bandaged, IV lines trailing from his paw, and knelt beside him. Leo opened one eye, barely, and Thomas smiled through tears. "You made it," he whispered. "Now we figure out the rest." And in his heart, he already knew. He wouldn't be going home alone. Leo's recovery wasn't fast, but it was nothing short of miraculous. Day by day, the lion who had once collapsed in the road began to regain strength. At first, it was just the flick of a tail, a shift in breathing, the twitch of a paw during sleep. But then, he started lifting his head when Thomas entered the room. His eyes would follow the man with calm recognition, no fear, no panic. The staff called it remarkable. Thomas called it fate. Every morning he was there. Same flannel shirt, same soft voice. "Hey buddy, I'm here." The center allowed Thomas to volunteer, unofficially at first. He helped clean stalls, prep meals, and observe other animals in rehab. But he always ended his shift beside Leo. The bond between them deepened in silence. Thomas never pushed, never reached too quickly. He just sat, sometimes reading aloud, sometimes just breathing beside the massive cat. One day, Leo did something unexpected. He leaned his head against the bars toward Thomas, resting it there. A silent gesture. A truce. And in that simple contact, something inside Thomas cracked open and began to heal. News of the rescue began to spread. Local reporters caught wind of the lion in the pickup truck, and soon Thomas was being asked for interviews. He declined most of them. "It wasn't about me," he'd say. "It was about him." But he did agree to speak to a group of students visiting the sanctuary. Standing beside Leo's enclosure, he told them what it meant to care for something wounded, to be patient with pain. The kids were mesmerized. Some cried. And Thomas saw, for the first time in years, a purpose in his own voice. Authorities opened an investigation. And soon, the story behind Leo's past began to emerge. He had belonged to an unlicensed exotic animal collector who had vanished weeks before Leo was found. The property was in shambles. Cages overturned, animals gone or dead. It was likely Leo had wandered for days, maybe weeks, before collapsing from infection and exhaustion. Thomas listened to the reports with a clenched jaw. "He was left to die," he said, voice low. "Not anymore." There was no one claiming Leo. No owner, no paperwork, no resistance to what came next. The wildlife center couldn't legally release Leo into the wild. He'd never learned how to hunt, avoid danger, or fend for himself, but releasing him to a zoo felt just as cruel. Thomas spoke at the town council meeting, voice steady, eyes fierce. "He's not a spectacle," he said. "He's a survivor, and he deserves peace, not a cage." It wasn't easy, but the center, with support from local donors, agreed to construct a special semi-open habitat, 5 acres of forested land on the center's grounds, where Leo could live out his life in dignity and safety. When the habitat was finished, Thomas was there to see Leo take his first steps into the open space. It was early morning, mist still curling above the grass. The door opened, and Leo stood still for a moment, nostrils flaring. Then, with a slow and deliberate motion, he stepped forward. The trees rustled, a bird cried out, and Leo disappeared into the woods, not afraid, not uncertain, but finally free. Thomas watched with tears in his eyes, a quiet smile on his face. "Go on," he whispered. "You've earned it." Their relationship didn't end there. Every morning, Thomas visited the edge of the habitat. Sometimes he saw Leo through the trees, resting beneath the pines, or sitting silently near the fence. Other times, the lion didn't appear at all. But Thomas didn't mind. It wasn't about seeing him, it was about showing up, about consistency, about loyalty. And over time, Thomas realized Leo had taught him something no grief counselor, no book, no sermon ever had. That healing isn't loud. It's slow. It's quiet. It's showing up, even when it hurts. People in town started treating Thomas differently. The quiet man with the haunted eyes became the man who saved the lion. He received letters from strangers, hugs from neighbors, even an invitation to speak at a state wildlife conference. He politely declined the spotlight, but the recognition didn't bother him. Not like it would have before. Because now, he understood. This wasn't about ego. It was about connection. about showing what it looks like when someone refuses to give up on something the world has already written off. One afternoon, a woman approached him at the sanctuary. She introduced herself as Dr. Rachel Lyman, head of an animal therapy program for veterans. "I heard your story," she said. "I think there's something more you could do here." They sat, they talked, they dreamed up a plan. And just like that, Thomas found himself involved in a new mission, helping others find healing through animals like Leo. The sanctuary would expand, and Thomas would help guide it. Not because he was an expert, but because he understood what it meant to be broken and found. As summer rolled in, Thomas stood once again at the edge of Leo's habitat. This time, the lion came out from the trees and sat a few yards away, watching him with that same quiet intensity. No fear, no sadness, just presence. Thomas took a deep breath. "You didn't just survive," he said softly. "You helped me do the same." Behind him, the sound of children laughing echoed through the trees. A school group arriving for a tour. Thomas turned toward the sound, heart full. The lion stayed behind, still watching, still present, still healing. By fall, the sanctuary had transformed. What once was a quiet, underfunded rescue facility had become a symbol of second chances. With new donations flowing in and volunteers arriving weekly, the energy around the place had shifted entirely. At the center of it all was Leo, not in a spotlight, not on display, but as a silent ambassador of survival. And by his side always was Thomas. The man who had once driven aimlessly through empty roads now had a calendar full of purpose, and a heart no longer ruled by silence. Thomas's home, too, had changed. What was once a house frozen in time had slowly come alive again. The porch swing creaked not with sorrow, but with laughter from children visiting with their parents after sanctuary tours. Leo couldn't leave the grounds, but Thomas brought the world to him. Veterans, retirees, kids from broken homes, all of them drawn to something they couldn't quite explain. He called it lion medicine, and it wasn't about fur or teeth. It was about being seen when you're at your lowest, and being loved anyway. Small gestures made the biggest difference. A boy who hadn't spoken since his father died, whispering to Leo through the fence. A widowed woman bringing hand-sewn blankets for rescued animals. A grizzled Marine who visited once a week just to sit in silence. Leo didn't need to do tricks. He just needed to exist. Strong, calm, alive. And Thomas? He had finally allowed himself to feel again. The grief over Linda would never vanish, but it no longer owned him. Leo hadn't filled the hole. He'd simply shown Thomas it was okay to grow around it. The sanctuary launched a new initiative called the Leo Project, a program pairing rescued animals with people navigating trauma. Thomas became its reluctant but beloved face. At every event, he wore the same weathered flannel, same quiet smile. He spoke gently but with gravity, never dramatizing what happened on that road. "He looked at me like I mattered," he once told a crowd of 500. And I realized I wasn't ready to give up either. There wasn't a dry eye in the audience. Newspapers across the state ran headlines like "The Lion That Saved a Man" and "Second Chances in the Arizona Pines." But Thomas never read them. He didn't need to. His validation came every morning when Leo emerged from the trees and sat by the fence, watching the man who never gave up on him. They had an understanding, one built not on language but on pain shared and peace earned. And though neither had planned it, they had become each other's proof that survival could still hold meaning. Years passed, and Thomas grew older, slower. His hands ached more in winter, and his steps grew cautious. But every morning, rain or shine, he made the walk down the gravel path to Leo's enclosure. On some days, Leo stayed hidden, deep in the brush. But more often than not, he'd appear, that slow, regal gait carrying years of dignity. And Thomas would nod and smile, sometimes leaning against the fence, sometimes just sitting beside it in silence. There were no words needed anymore, just presence, just trust. When Leo eventually passed, quietly, under the trees he loved, Thomas sat with him until the sky turned gold. There were no cameras, no crowds, just one man and his lion, and the heavy silence of goodbye. Thomas wept, not with devastation but with gratitude. He placed a hand on Leo's mane one last time and whispered, "You kept me alive too." The sanctuary held a quiet memorial. People brought candles, stones, flowers. But Thomas didn't speak that day. He simply stood, hand on the fence, and let the silence speak for him. A bronze statue of Leo was placed at the entrance of the sanctuary 6 months later, not as a monument of captivity, but as a symbol of healing. At the base, a plaque read, "For the lost, the found, and those who keep showing up." Thomas had written it himself. His daughter, once distant, now visited regularly, proud of the man her father had become. And the sanctuary continued to grow, one story at a time, one rescue after another. People came from all over just to walk the grounds and feel what Leo had once given freely, hope. Now in his 70s, Thomas trains new volunteers and oversees the Leo Project. His hair is silver, his voice softer, but his spirit unbreakable. People ask him all the time what made him stop that night, what made him pull over for a dying lion. He always answers the same way. "I wasn't saving him. I was recognizing him." The kids laugh, the adults nod, and somewhere in the trees a wind rustles gently, like a whisper from an old friend, still watching, still present. Because in the end, it wasn't just about saving a lion. It wasn't even about healing grief. It was about being brave enough to stop when no one else would. Brave enough to kneel beside something broken. Brave enough to believe that love, even between a man and a lion, could rewrite everything. He didn't just save a lion, he came back to life with him.